So I think we'll start. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm, as some of you may know, Arndís Bergsdóttir, and I'm the organizer of these lecture series. Thank you for joining us today. Today I have the pleasure of introducing ROC's postdoc, Wesley Farnsworth, who will give his lecture, Tephra Constrains Natural and Anthropogenic Changes in Icelandic Lakes. So for those of you who don't know Wesley, he has a background in glacial geology, periglacial landscapes and slope processes with an emphasis on quaternary mapping. So prior to starting this project, his project at the ROC's Research Center, Wesley has investigated the distal deposition of tephra within the North Atlantic, and he was also a Nordvolk fellow. Wes, I'm delighted to have you with us today, and I now give the floor to you.
Thank you, Arndís. I'll start by sharing my screen here. So people can hear me, people can see my screen. Can I get a thumbs up or a nod? Make sure everybody's on board here. Great. Okay, so my name is Wes Farnsworth. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Iceland and the University in Copenhagen. I'm funded by the Carlsberg Foundation, and today I'll introduce a little bit of the work I've been doing as part of this postdoc, which is associated with the ROC's Research Center. Obviously, this is part of the ROC's lecture series, but I'll try to give a little bit of background on this project here. So this is a large research center that brings together natural scientists and artists to focus on different aspects of how humans and oceans and climate interact with each other. This was in part given by the Danish state and the Icelandic state to Queen Margaret II and Vigdis Finnbogadóttir as part of an interdisciplinary research center on oceans, climate, and society. It's led by Professor Catherine Richardson at the University of Copenhagen. She's part of the Globe Institute. And what I guess is unique or stands out about the terrestrial side of this project is that it's largely been supported by Professor Kirk Kjær and Esker Willeslef, also at the University of Copenhagen, as part of the Center for Geogenetics. So that's kind of what has made this become a little bit more than merely a two-year postdoc research project. So there's reasons why we're studying Iceland. One of them being its sensitive location in the middle of the North Atlantic. So Iceland sits at the confluence of warm waters that travel up through the North Atlantic, as well as these cooler waters that travel down the coast of East Greenland. So it's right at the confluence of these water masses. Additionally, Iceland is characterized by widespread volcanoes and volcanic activity through the post-glacial era. And the product of these volcanoes is widespread tephra layers. And we use these tephra to correlate sedimentary archives between space across Iceland and even into parts of the North Atlantic. Additionally, Iceland is unique given its location in the middle of the North Atlantic. It has essentially a Holocene without humans. So following the documented settlement just over 1,000 years ago, the bulk of the Holocene is actually human-free, which means it's a little easier to disentangle the effects of humans and also the naturally occurring shifts in climate and environment. So in the middle of the North Atlantic, interestingly enough, it actually has a quite large population of animals and plants. There's 28 mammals, 75 nesting birds. At different points, there's probably been over 100 or 110 nesting birds. There's maybe 350 birds that visit and on migratory routes, but aren't necessarily based in Iceland. There's a little over 1,000 insects today, and this is probably an underestimate of actually how many exist in Iceland. And there's a little over 500 plants, and these are different sort of woody species and mainly low vegetation. But it's important to know that Iceland hasn't always looked like this. So not too long ago, in the recent past, Iceland was covered by a large ice sheet. It was a marine-based ice sheet. It extended out to the continental shelf. It was probably on the order of 2 kilometers thick in the interior. And I'll play a short video here. This is a model that was created by Henry Patton and others, which depicts the growth and decay of the Icelandic ice sheet during the last glacial cycle. And you can see the colors and the colors that are displayed here indicate the flow velocity of the ice. And you can see that the ice extent reaches the continental shelf break sometime probably around 23 or 24,000 years ago. It reaches its maximum extent. And following this maximum, it eventually collapses back into the interior, okay? So this ice sheet, several thousand years over Iceland, has been a very effective means at eroding and sort of removing the sediment and the soil from the island as we know it, okay? So sometime during the early Holocene, the last bit of the Icelandic ice sheet decays and it retreats back to the Iceland that we know today. And I guess one thing that I want you to consider is this Iceland, right after the deglaciation, it might resemble a clean slate. It's unclear if there's plants or animals that survived this last glacial cycle. So it might not look as vegetated as it is today. So I have it in black and white here. Although the vegetation and plants might be a clean slate, the geology of Iceland is not. So there's quite interesting and complex geology across Iceland. Some of the older strata is seen in blue here. So that's to the west and the east. And this is strata that's some 15 or 16 million years old. And you get younger as you move towards the center part of Iceland, towards the central rift. And these red circles here and these numbers indicate different central volcanoes. And there's obviously been quite some volcanic activity to form Iceland, as well as volcanic activity since the last glaciation. Now, each one of these volcanic systems can be characterized by its major elemental composition. So the products that come from these eruptions have sort of unique signatures, and you can look at the major elemental composition and in often cases link it to specific volcanic provinces, and they're color-coded here as a handful of the sort of the more, I guess, active ones through the Holocene, through the post-glacial. And through time, after the deglaciation, these successive eruptions are interbedded with soil that's developed. So you can see here a soil section with a handful of different ash layers deposited within it. And sometimes there are these dark layers, sometimes there are these white layers. But the idea being, tephrochronology forms a framework for us to not only date in some cases, but to link between different archives. So this is a soil section, but the ash that fell in this soil section also fell in a nearby lake, and it also fell on the nearby marine environment or the nearby glacier. So we can use these specific ash layers across space to link archives and essentially correlate between different records. So this is just an example of an isopack map from the large explosive eruption about 4,000 years ago from Hekla. And you can see here that this large eruption deposited tens of centimeters of ash proximal to Hekla. And as we move more distal to the northeast, it's thinner ash layers, but it's still present in a visible fashion. This ash is actually deposited all the way over into Europe and is used as a marker layer across the North Atlantic. And in a geologic time period, although it might fall over the course of days or weeks or years even, in a geologic time period, it falls in an instant, so it's an isochrone. Now, we can take samples of this tephra. This is an example of what this sort of porous glass can look like. We can take samples of this and analyze it. And if we get concentrated samples, we can pack them into plugs. And these are sort of epoxy mounts that we use in the electron microprobe. And this is just an example of what that can look like. And these are different basaltic and rhyolitic glass, and the same thing goes for here. And what we do is we map out where we want to take probe points, and then we collect this data, and it gives us major elemental composition of the glass. And we can use this major elemental composition to compare between different provinces. So we can characterize the glass itself and where it sits, depending on how silica rich it is. Now, it's important to know that although we talked about the deglaciation occurring sometime during the late glacial and the early Holocene, most of the soil section in Iceland actually only extend back to really the end of the middle Holocene, the transition between early and middle Holocene, which means that we don't have a very good record of what occurred right after the deglaciation. The soil sections don't preserve it. So the volcanic history, our understanding of volcanic history during this early Holocene is really built not just on soil, but it's actually largely built on marine and lacustrine archives. And that brings me to the point of why we actually study lacustrine archives. So lakes are high resolution archives for investigating glacial, climate, volcanic, and sea level history. And it's important to know that each lake is different, right? So each lake record is unique, depending on how proximal the lake is to the ocean, what its elevation is, maybe how big the catchment is, how deep the water column is, maybe when they started to farm in the lake catchment, or if they built a road along the lake. These are all things that will affect the lake story, the lake record. So by connecting these lake records to ancient sedimentary DNA techniques, we'll be able to get a whole, more detailed understanding of actually what happened in these lake catchments through time. So as a little bit of background on some of the lake work in Iceland, there's actually been quite some really extensive lake work in Iceland because these are such nice archives. And you can see here, these orange dots represent a handful of studies that have investigated lake sediments that extend back through the Holocene. And interestingly enough, a couple of these lake studies, the lowermost strata is actually not lake, it's marine sediments. So right after deglaciation, because of isostatic adjustment, these actually, the lake records terminate in marine sediments. The other lake records, though, they terminate in lacustrine sediments. And these lacustrine sediments provide this nice high resolution, and they don't have necessarily this radiocarbon marine influence. So we'll focus on these lake records. And there's one lake record that stands out because that one, unlike the other lakes, penetrates through the early Holocene and is believed to penetrate back into the late glacial. So there's a handful of records that have characterized the pollen and the tephra in this lake basin. And it was cored, from work in the early 90s, and has been cored by many groups through the last decades. So it's definitely formed it's one of the few records that extends back this far. So it's been a calibration stake, I guess, for understanding how the climate has changed through time. And more recently, a group actually did the first ancient sedimentary DNA in Iceland, where they analyzed sediments from this lake. And this shows a very interesting rapid colonization of plants following the deglaciation. But interestingly enough, this lake record doesn't quite penetrate down into the glacial sediments. So it's not quite to the base of the full record, or what's believed to be the full record. And I guess, so all of these other lakes, they don't quite reach this. And whether that's because they didn't deglaciate in time, or because they don't quite penetrate through a very large ash layer that was deposited around 10,000 years ago. So the Saxonavatna ash, or it's more referred to as the G10 series, that's a very thick basaltic ash layer, or it's actually a series of ash layers that was deposited around 10,000 years ago. And those in the lake basins can sometimes be tens of centimeters or even more. And this is a challenge to core through. And ultimately, a lot of these lake records end in kind of the false bottom associated with the Saxonavatna ash. Now, there is one lake record that does penetrate through this and extends actually back beyond 11K. But for the most part, all these other studies don't provide a whole lot more of the early Holocene. Okay, So in addition to obviously collecting more lake records that penetrate back through the early Holocene, I'd like to be able to use these lake networks, or this lake network, to better constrain the timing of deglaciation. So to try to use them as a means to enhance our understanding of the timing that the ice retreated back. I would also like to use them to better understand the volcanic history during this period in time, from the time of deglaciation into kind of 10,000 years ago, when we have the sedimentation of the G10 series. Additionally, one of the goals I have is to constrain this large lake network for different said DNA studies and paleoclimate records. And with this, these goals, hopefully we can get at some of these larger questions. For example, what was the style of and the timing of colonization of plants and animals following the last deglaciation? Additionally, I'd like to try to use this to understand the timing and the dynamics associated with human settlement in Iceland, and subsequently how land use has influenced this pristine environment. And with these lake records, we'll also hopefully be able to get at an understanding of how explosive volcanism can influence these ecosystems or these catchments or species within them. So these are some of the larger scale questions. But ultimately, we need to develop a nice lake network that spans different climatic and environmental gradients. And we also need to target settlement sites in regions with early deglaciation. So I'm pretty confident in being able to identify sites that probably deglaciated earlier. But as far as settlement sites go, I don't have an enormous amount of background in that. And there's plenty of stuff that can be read up on, and you can get an understanding of how Iceland was settled. And they're fascinating stories that can obviously orient you and where you should maybe start looking for this early settlement. But it's also probably more realistic and practical to just coordinate and work alongside people who've been doing this for their career. So the ROCS research, research group is closely linked with people, not just natural scientists, but archaeologists and people from the humanities who are studying archives and different written records. And this is an example of one of the collaborators. So this is Bjarni Einarsson, and Bjarni has been asking a similar question to us for his career, with how he can better understand the timing, the style of settlement. And he describes that a little bit in this report about a Viking age settlement site, or a longhouse that he's been excavating. And interestingly enough, this is in the East Fjords. And he spent a couple of years excavating this site in Stöð and associated with the earliest of settlement. And it was only a few years into excavating it that he realized that there was an even older house underneath it, which obviously came before the Viking age house. So as it stands today, this is one of the largest and most rich excavation sites in Iceland. Another person that we collaborate with is Árni Einarsson. And so Árni has an extensive understanding of the ecological systems associated with lakes in Iceland. But he's also an avid mapper with a drone, and he's developed techniques to go out and map and photograph terrain in Iceland that have these sort of early sites, early farms and early land use sites. And this is just an example of one from the west of Iceland here. So by linking up with these specialists, we're able to get an understanding of where we should probably target lakes. So we're trying to find lakes that are obviously linked with these early settlement. So this is just an example from the west here. And I'll also give you an example of an ash layer that's deposited in the lakes and also just in soil sections. So this layer here is called the Landnam Tephra. And it's actually two different Tephra layers. So it's deposited in a very short interval in time. And it's around 871 AD. So these two different Tephra layers, one's from Bardabunga Veiðivatn, the other one's from Torfajökull, have these components of basaltic and rhyolitic. And it's a unique marker layer. And interestingly enough, it occurs around the time that people believe Iceland was settled. So we can use this in our lake records to I guess, target where to focus our studies. Okay, so there's two key things that we're trying to collect in our lake network. We want to collect this sediment water interface, which is the most recent accumulation of material in the bottom of the lake. And we also want to collect basal sediments. So we want to get down to the glacial sediments, which means that we were right at the start, right at the beginning of the tabula rasa, the clean slate. So we thought we were pretty lucky. We had a short window in August 2020 where we sort of had a small reconnaissance, and we visited a handful of lakes in the south. And we even managed to collect the first lake records of the network on a small raft. And we had high hopes for the early spring of 2021, but ultimately the only thing we were really able to collect is a handful of positive COVID tests. Fortunately, I was able to convince my wife in early spring 2021 to go out and core some of these lakes with me and our dog. So despite being quite pregnant at the time, we managed to collect another handful of records, which helped with growing the network. It wasn't until March 2022 that we actually were able to sort of fulfill this ROCS research center by getting Danish researchers and Icelandic researchers out in the field to collect data together. So that's when we really started to get to work on the lake network itself. And as we worked through coring across the country, we had different people showing up to help out. This is an example of Eske doing some drilling in the lake. And we got to work on collecting sediments. This is just a short video of us hammering down into some of the basal sediments of the lake up in the northeast of Iceland. And while we were pretty productive in March, we also, I guess, came to an abrupt end. As one of the things we also collected was a handful of more of positive COVID tests. So despite the challenges, we've managed to put together a pretty large network of lakes across Iceland. And this is what it looks like today. So these red boxes indicate lakes that have been cored, where we just collect the upper sort of meter to 2 meters of sediment. So these are just like the late Holocene studies. And the green records here, these little boxes, these are the full post-glacial series. So this is where, in theory, we reach all the way down to the glacial sediments, or the most recent glacial sediments, and have the full post-glacial sequence, so the Holocene on top. And in some cases, these lake records are 3 or 4 meters. In other cases, they're up to 10 meters. So they're quite high resolution series. Now, the lakes we're targeting, obviously, we want early deglaciation, and we want lakes that are associated with settlement sites, but we also kind of want these small catchments with controlled basins, and we want them to be across a wide range of environments. So they range from pretty much at sea level to a little over 700 meters above sea level. Some of them are right on the coast, others are part of the interior in the highlands, and the basin depths are anywhere between just under a meter to a little over, to around 17 meters beneath the ice surface. Now, once these cores are sent back to Copenhagen, they're split open and they go through the core scanning facilities that we have. So this is just a photo of Marie-Louise, who's running one of the cores through the iTrax scanner. Now, the other half, this half is the archive record. So we scan it and then we just keep it in the fridge. The other half is the working half, and that goes straight to the clean room. And what we've been doing is sampling these at a very high resolution. So every 1.5 centimeters, we're using a syringe to take an archive sample, which is then frozen, and we'll figure out, depending on the resolution of the lake sediments, once we establish a chronology, we'll figure out how detailed we want to sequence the samples. So we're starting out by doing a very detailed archiving. So when you get a lake core, you split it open, it might look something like this. When you scan it, you don't only get the optical image, but you get the radiograph, the X-ray. And with the iTrax scanner, you also get an enormous amount of data related to magnetic susceptibility and different elemental composition. And that can be really helpful in characterizing the sediments that we have and also identifying different tephra layers. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation in this part of the record here. And you can see that different tephra layers have different colors, and they also have different chemical properties. So in some of these longer records, these green records that go back to the post-glaciation, we use this iTrax data to actually correlate between the different cores that we took. So this is just an example from the Northeast, where there's 10 different cores that are linked together into one series. And this constitutes about a 10-meter record. And you can see again that these spikes here are associated with tephra layers, and these red marks just indicate where we link our cores together. So we're able to, in most cases, pretty effectively correlate these. Now, with regards to these lake records, getting a good constraint on the base of these, the basal age, is key for understanding the deglaciation. So with this large network, it'd be really nice to get good constraint on the basal age sediments. So getting ages from here. And with that, hopefully we can use this network to better constrain models like this. And even sort of time slices that are established that, for example, this recent review from Ivar and Benediktsson and others, we can plot our lake networks on there, and we can use this to validate where these inferred ice margins are, and maybe improve our understanding of what ice cover looked like at these specific intervals in time, like the end of the Younger Dryas. Now, one of the things that we also hope to do is to characterize the tephra, and specifically this sort of tephra at the oldest end of the record, so beneath the Saxonavane ash layer, the G10 series. So this is pretty recent data from this last week on the probe, and you can see that this thick black ash layer that we sort of assumed was the G10 series, it has chemical characteristics like Grimsvatnet, so it probably is associated with the G10 series. We also have this large rhyolitic and basaltic ash layer called Askja S, which is known from the Northeast region. And between these marker horizons, we can also identify a couple ash layers, which are mainly basaltic, and probably what we have is just a reworked silicic component of the Askja S series. And it's not uncommon that you have sort of reworked ash following these large eruptions. But what's interesting is that underneath this Askja S series, we have a series of Askja-like eruptions as well. And they're interbedded with probably a Hekla basalt. And this sort of might be precursors to what ended up being this large explosive Askja S eruption. So we start to get a more detailed understanding of what was going on prior to 10,000 years ago, at least in the Northeast where this is from. Additionally, there's an even older ash layer that's has similar chemistry to Katla. So it's a Katla-like eruption with silicic glass. So this is obviously just one of a handful of lake records from the Northeast. This one's from up here. And hopefully by working up these lower sequences, we'll be able to get a better understanding of maybe some earlier marker layers that aren't that well described or understood from Iceland. Now, if we move a little bit closer to home here, I'll give you an example of a lake called Tjörnen. And this is a lake right in the middle of Reykjavik. And you can see that it's quite populated today. And it's also believed that there was an early population there around the time of settlement. So if you go out there in an early spring evening, you can go out and take a lake core just right in town. And this is what the lake core looks like. And this is the radiograph. And you can see these little green dots indicate where we've sampled for DNA. So very, continuous high resolution. And what we've done is we've just sort of selected some 40 of these samples here in red. And these we're going to put forth, or we've put forth for sequencing. So we'll get a little bit of an understanding with this data set. And we've also put forth a handful of those intervals for lipid analysis, for looking at biomarkers as well. So we should get a nice holistic understanding of this catchment. And if we plot out the age depth model, there's a handful of these nice historic eruptions that are described from Reykjavik. We go down to the Landnam ash layer, which is the settlement ash layer. And we can also link this with the scan data. So this is kind of what a data set from one of these lakes will look like. And interestingly enough, you can see that the tephra jumps out pretty clear in these sharp peaks in the MS and the density. We obviously have a handful of C14 ages that help constrain the age depth model in some cases. In other cases, might be a little exaggerated. But you can see that there's a pretty strong spike in pollutants, and that's probably associated with the industrialization of Reykjavik. So it'll be really exciting to start to get some of this data that we can put into this sort of geochronological framework, and that's supposed to be coming pretty soon. So a little overview on where we're at. There's 57 different lake basins that have been sampled, a little over 200 meters of sediment. 10 of these lakes presumably go down to the post-glacial. So, somewhere around 12,000 years ago. Of the 200 meters of sediment, we'll probably just be working with about 150 meters of these. So 120 of those meters have been scanned through with the iTrax scanner in Copenhagen, and they've also been archive sampled. So there's a little over 7,000 DNA samples. We're in the process of working up the geochronology, and that's with C14, and that's with not lead-210, but plutonium, a radiometric method at the top to constrain the post-modern sediments. And we also have analyzed over 200 ash layers. And that's probably around half of what we'll end up analyzing. Ultimately, we want to be able to link our understanding of these lake records to what we are learning in the marine realm. So as this research center is associated with the oceans, climate, and society, we want to link not only the climatic findings that we have from Iceland, but we want to link it to some of the older sediments that we're finding off the shelf edge. And that's mainly being worked up by another postdoc named Rebecca Jackson. So that's one of the ending goals as well of this project. So I'd like just to close by saying thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.